Good morning, everyone, and welcome to a webinar organised by the Community Ownership Fund Support Programme to help applicants to write a strong funding application. My name is Zoe Goddard. I work for Locality, which is one of the 10 community support organisations delivering the COF support programme for the Department of Levelling Up Homes and Communities. I'm co-hosting this webinar today with my colleague Debbie Lamb, and we're also joined by Rachel Day from the programme team, who is kindly supporting us to deliver the webinar today. I'm going to turn my cameras off now, but we can turn them back on when we're doing the questions later on. Okay, so firstly, the Community Ownership Fund Support Programme is helping applicants in a number of ways. We have useful resources available on the My Community website, including recordings of our webinars. There's an advice service for any questions about the Community Ownership Fund and the support available. The inquiry form is on the My Community website, and there's a team of inquiry handlers across the UK helping to answer your queries. There are also in-depth support packages available, which will be offered to some groups to help them apply. These one-to-one support packages and access to small revenue grants are offered to a small number of organisations who have successfully passed the expression of interest stage and are assets that are in areas of high need based on national metrics like indices of multiple deprivation, the Community Needs Index, diversity of populations, and also it's based on the support needs of community organisations themselves. If you'd like to find out more about in-depth support, please have a look on the My Community pages. So the webinar today will take approximately 2 hours. I'm giving a short introduction about the COF programme and how to apply. And I'm also going to give an overview of the strategic case that applicants need to make in their application. We will then stop for some questions before I hand over to Debbie, who will be focusing on what is required to submit a strong management case. We have lots of slides to get through, which we will send out to all attendees after the webinar. If you've got any questions, please add them into the question and answer function box rather than the chat box. We're going to stop 3 times today to answer as many questions as we can. We probably won't be able to answer all the questions, but we will follow up in the correspondence after the webinar. So what is the Community Ownership Fund? It's a £150 million fund that Department of Levelling Up Homes and Communities have set up to help local communities across the UK to take control of assets, amenities or facilities that are at risk of loss without community intervention. That risk can be from closure, sale, neglect and dereliction under current ownership, energy efficiency that threatens long-term sustainable operations of the asset, and unsustainable current business models. And the key term here really to think about is at risk. COF isn't about funding expansions or improvements to assets which are not at risk. It's about saving community assets that will be, which are at threat of loss without community intervention. The fund is running until March 2025. And so far, approximately £24 million has been offered to 98 projects. The next round of announcements is going to be happening in September. So the next batch of successful projects is going to be announced by the government soon. The funding available from round 3 includes groups being able to apply for up to 2 million in capital. But DLUC, the Department of Levelling Up, expect most awards will be for up to 250,000 of capital funding. This capital funding must be matched by 20% or more from alternative funding sources. And groups can also apply for revenue funding of 20% of their capital ask up to a maximum of £50,000. And that's to help fund revenue costs in the first year alongside the capital funding. And I think what we'd say is, groups should be confident to do this, to put in costs around staff, energy bills, other running costs. And the feedback from DLUC is that presently groups aren't applying for as much as they're entitled to. So really have a think about that. It's not just a capital fund. There is that revenue available to help to cover those early running costs. Funding has to be drawn down and spent within 12 months, which can be a challenge for when you're asking for higher quantities of capital funding. And match funding must be secured before you can draw down the grant. So this is a big factor in deciding how much you're going to apply to COF for. So how do you apply? An expression of interest form to check eligibility and to look at the strategic fit can be submitted to DLUC at any time. If a group passes the EOI, they receive a unique application form link from DLUC every time a round opens. So we've had feedback from applicants that they think that once you've got that unique application form link, you have to apply in the next round. What we'd say is that COF requires a lot of work to go into putting in a good, strong application. So once you've had an EOI passed, you will always get the link to any future rounds right up to the end of the programme. So it's about choosing the right round to apply in when your project is ready and your application is ready. Groups only need to submit one EOI and only need to submit a new one if your project has changed substantially. So for example, it's a different asset that you're looking at. There's 4 funding rounds a year. The current round 3, bidding window 2, opened on the 30th of August and closes on the 10th of October at noon. And again, the prospectus does state that it's noon, but again, we found that people have sometimes thought it's midnight. So please be aware that it's the deadline is noon on that date. DLUC will have written to all successful EOI applicants on the 30th of August with a link to the full application portal. We recommend using the Word version of the form that we've created on My Community to draft your answers. And that's because if you start filling in the application form, but then you run out of time before the deadline, your work that you've put into that online form will be lost unless you submit that application form. So we really strongly ask you or recommend that have a look at the Word version on My Community. It's also really useful then because you can share your answers with board members, you can share your answers with any consultants you might be working with to draft really good answers. If you are unsuccessful, groups can reapply as many times as they like. And as I said, the programme opens until March 2025. Other points to bear in mind when filling in your application. DLUC will only go back to applicants briefly during the assessment process. So the grant assessors have got a maximum of 30 minutes for a call to clarify any queries that they have, so which isn't very long. So they really are relying on everything you put in the application form, your business plan and attachments. We know that in the past, some groups have struggled with a limited number of attachments that are on the application form. There is a list of supplementary documents provided by DLUC that they suggest you refer to in your application, and that is quite extensive. So you really need to think about how you can compile all that really important information into the amount of attachments you've got. So for example, perhaps having a risk register on an Excel document where there's lots of different tabs to put in all your other financial information like cash flow forecasts and things like that. We recommend that you refer to the evidence in those key documents in your application form. So giving examples, comparisons and referencing research that you may have undertaken, or referencing other local plans that show the need for your asset. It's really important to explain your reasoning and be consistent in the application. There's 2 elements to the application, the strategic case and the management case. And we're going to focus mainly on the management case today because the feedback from DLUC is that it's that area that many groups don't meet the basic assessment criteria on. And what we would say is, as well as looking at the prospectus, please look at the assessment criteria and scoring matrix on DLUC's website to look at what's really required in detail. In terms of avoiding problems later, if you do get an offer of funding, please note that projects can't be changed after submission. So if you don't put a revenue funding ask in your application, you can't ask for one later, for example. Or if the building falls through, COF funding cannot be transferred to another asset. When you spend match is also really important as well. The prospectus states that you can't spend the match before that COF application window closes in the window that you're applying for, because that match is then not eligible if you do that. The safest way is to wait until your application is successful and you talk to DLUC about permissioning to spend that match. And that's, some projects have fallen through on that they've spent their match, they haven't been successful, and then when they reapply, that match is no longer eligible again. So it's really about talking to funders, getting them lined up and aligned with the COF application windows. It's important to know from the start that DLUC may take a charge on the asset, and this may affect the availability of interest rates and on loan finance. And understanding what the COF procurement rules are is really important as well, because if you are starting to put tenders out or getting quotes, they need to meet their criteria, or you might have to find that you have to do those that procurement again. So it's about understanding those procurement rules. Also seek advice if your organisation is subject to any legal action. So for example, check if any of your directors have been disqualified in the past, because that has been an issue for some applicants. So as we've said, as well as reading the prospectus, please, we recommend that you read the assessment criteria that DLUC has put on their website to see if your project is a good fit for the programme, and you'll be able to put in a strong application. Because meeting the eligibility criteria and passing the EOI stage does not necessarily mean that you're going to be a good fit for the programme. The assessment criteria will help you to understand if your project and your organisation is a good fit for COF, and how and the information required to submit a strong application. You might find when looking at that assessment criteria that actually other funding programmes might be a better fit. So DLUC have two different types of assessment criteria. They have the strategic case and they have the management case. And for the strategic case and management case, there are sub-criteria which are each given a score of 1 to 5. And these scores are weighted as shown in the brackets. So you can see that community benefits, community engagement, and financial risks and forecasts all have a weighting to show that these are really key areas of the application form to really focus attentions on. There is a minimum score of 16 for the strategic case to be able to be shortlisted, and a minimum weighted score of 15 for the management case for your application to be shortlisted as well. And then applicants are also required to score a minimum of 12 across the sections of funding breakdown, financial risks and forecasts, and skills and resources of the management case. And that's what my colleague Debbie is going to be really looking at in detail later in the webinar. We've included a couple of slides today on the strategic case to give you an overview, but as I said, the majority of the session is going to focus on those management case areas and how you can meet those minimum requirements. The strategic case, though, is still really critical because it helps determine whether the investment from COF is going to mean that the asset won't be lost to the community. So this strategic case is really about explaining the risk and what will be lost and the benefits of saving it. So under current and community use, it's thinking about and explaining who in the community currently uses the asset or has used it in the past. Why is the asset at risk of loss, and how would this loss affect the community? Why will the asset be lost without this COF community intervention? And why is the asset better in community hands? What's the added value of being a community asset? So a strong application would demonstrate how the asset is used by the community with evidence of that. So numbers of users, examples of community participation. There'll be a strong connection made between the risk of loss and the impact that this would have on the community. And that risk is high and well evidenced. So perhaps a sale is imminent, or there's critical issues with the buildings, the fabric of the building. In terms of engagement and local support, how has the community been consulted and shaped plans for the asset? How can you demonstrate local support for the asset? How do plans for the asset fit with the wider plans for the area? And can you give details of local support, including any partners? So again, a strong application would reference multiple ways the community is involved in the plans for the asset, the governance of your group, and the day-to-day delivery of activities. It's about that strong evidence of the asset reaching a wide base within the community. There's a significant range of partners, and there's evidence provided of that support. And there's strong connections made with local community plans, neighbourhood plans, things like that. Another area around the strategic case, which is really important, is the benefits. So what community benefits will the project deliver? What are the planned activities that will deliver those benefits? How will you deliver and sustain those benefits over time? And how will the asset benefit the whole community? So a strong application will have a clear set of proposed outcomes and how you will measure those outcomes. There will be a range of examples and an evidence base, perhaps from your track record or evidence from similar projects or similar assets. You will have undertaken research with the community and have links to that evidence base of the plans of what you want to deliver. You'll reference local data sets about the community. And really, there's a really clear vision of how those community benefits will impact different members of the community. For parish councils and town councils, a project that is looking for funding business as usual, sort of repairs to playgrounds and toilets, might struggle in terms of understanding how you're going to meet that added community benefit. Those projects might be technically eligible, but actually it's thinking about what are the added community benefits that this COF funding are going to bring. The last area is around environmental sustainability. How will the projects address this? How do plans for the building works address this issue moving forward? And does the project include action and leadership on climate change? So again, they're looking for tangible examples of plans to address sustainability, which will help the viability of the asset going forward.
Thanks, Zoe. I'm going to be talking about the management case and in a bit more detail than Zoe was able to do on the strategic case. So there are 4 elements to the management case: the funding breakdown, financial and risk forecasts, resources and skills, representation, inclusiveness and integration. And what I'm going to look at is what makes a strong application, the information that the assessor requires, and the underlying information and documentation that you might need to compile in order to put together a strong application. Next slide, please. So on the funding breakdown, we're looking at the cost of acquiring the asset, the cost of refurbishing the asset, the match funding that you need, which needs to be capital, and all in exhaustive detail. So I'm going to start off with acquiring the asset. Acquiring the asset, so it covers the agreed sale price or transfer terms. So how much the asset is going to cost if you are buying from a private buyer, or the terms of transfer if you're getting a community asset transfer from, say, the local authority. If you are buying the asset, you will need an independent valuation to show that the sale price is reasonable. If possible, you would have an agreement to sell or transfer. Now, it's not always possible, we know, with to get an agreement to sell. You may be in a competitive process to try and buy the asset on the open market. It may be up for auction. But if you are buying from a seller, if they have agreed a price with you, then being able to show that within the application is really helpful. Similarly with transfer, often community asset transfer negotiations can go on for a long time, be a lot of backwards and forwards discussions. You may not actually have an email or a letter which says we are prepared to transfer this building to XYZ organisation on the following terms. So really useful if the local authority can provide that kind of in-principle agreement. A time scale to acquire. Is it a case of just agreeing when it's all going to happen? Or is there something external, like an auction or like a competitive process? For community asset transfer, the actual finalisation of that transfer may need to go through various committees in the local authority. It may take 3 or 4 months. Important to be able to say how long it's going to take and to note any issues which might affect acquisition, like we have to get planning permission before we can complete the sale, or there are covenants on the building which we need to explore further before we can agree to purchase or acquire. Next slide, please, Zoe. Looking at refurbishing the asset. This would cover a detailed breakdown of the work that is needed to refurbish the asset and a detailed costing of that refurbishment work, including some contingency funds. We know that at the moment there are real problems about the cost of building materials and skilled trades going up quite steeply. So it is important to put in some contingency there to make sure that by the time the assessment has gone through, you are able to actually pay for the work, as it is likely to have increased. Similarly, DLAC will want to know the details of the professional advice that you have taken. So if you're taking on a building or you are refurbishing a building you already own, which has multiple problems, you will be expecting to do a condition survey. And potentially, if you don't already have that, that's something that if you're offered a support package, the small grant could help you with. It's important to know the condition of the whole of the building to make sure that the proposal you're putting forward is going to deal with all of the issues. You don't want to spend a load of money dealing with some of the problems with the building and 6 months later the roof starts leaking. So it is about being clear what the problems are with the building and showing that the refurbishment work that you're going to undertake is going to actually deal with it. We're also looking at the milestones for completing the building work. As Zoe pointed out, COF grant funding is expected to be spent within 12 months. So we're looking at how you're going to complete the building work within that kind of timescale. Clearly, if it's a very large building project, that may be really quite tight. There's also likely to be a sequencing about that building work, that you potentially start off by dealing with the roof and ingress of water. You may then move on to other parts of reshaping the internal of the building and so on. DLAC will want to know how the building work is going to be managed, and I'll be coming back to this again. But clearly, if it is a large building project, then do you have the skills in-house? Will you be buying in skills? And that's potentially something else that you can use the revenue grant for. Next slide, please. The breakdown of funding will need to cover the capital funding request to COF based on a breakdown of costs of acquisition and refurbishment plus contingency. It'll also include your revenue funding request and how that funding will be used. So that then gives you the total request from the Community Ownership Fund, capital plus revenue. You will also need to include the total cost of the project, and that'll show the match funding that you require. You will need to show how that match funding has been secured, well, how much of that match funding is already secured and what is still to secure, and the timescales for securing that outstanding match funding. And as Zoe said before, the really important thing is that you're showing when that match funding is likely to be available. You don't have to have secured all the match funding before you apply, but you do need to be showing that you've identified 4 or 5 funds, you've had discussions with those funds, and that it will be going to committee at a certain time, for example, or that you have an in-principle offer from a loan funding provider or something like that. In terms of what makes a strong application, on the funding breakdown, it is really that there are full costings with clear explanations, that there are no issues with eligibility. Now, we talked about the expression of interest before. When you get the response to your expression of interest, which says that you can apply, there may be some points made there saying, we think you're eligible, but we would like you to address this, this, and this in your application. Really important that you do look at that feedback and address those issues to make sure that you are confirming your eligibility. So all matches secured, or there is a clear route to securing the match within the timescale. That you have a project plan which sets out the milestones to spend within 12 months. The purpose of your revenue request is clear, showing how the revenue funding relates to the business plan and how it relates to securing the future of the asset. There are lots of ways in which that revenue funding can be used, but it is important that it's very clear how it relates to the rest. Next slide, please. Finance and risk forecasts. What you're being asked for is to give details of any completed or planned feasibility studies or research into income streams. Details of the planned activities or services in the asset. Now, where you're already running the asset, that will be details of what you're already doing, but also what the COF funding is going to allow you to do, which is additional. You're asked for financial forecasts, which include income sources and costs with an evidenced set of assumptions. An explanation of the use and need for COF revenue funding, cash flow forecasts, risks and mitigations. What we think this actually means is, in terms of the underpinning documentation, is that you will need income and expenditure budgets. We've already talked about capital budgets. You'll also need revenue, income and expenditure budgets. You'll need a cash flow forecast with detailed assumptions. We would suggest that's one for revenue and then one with revenue and capital combined. We are suggesting that you do some sensitivity analysis on your financial information. So that would be really looking at the what ifs. So what if you have 10% or 20% less customers than you were expecting? What if your utility bills are 20% higher than you were expecting? I think what your sensitivity analysis helps you with is to think about where you might in the first year need that revenue grant. Particularly where you're taking on a new building, you won't go from 0 income to 100% of what you're expecting quickly. You'll need to build up, and that revenue support can help you with that over the first year. You'll also need to put together a risk register, which you're expected to keep updating throughout the project, and actually should be updating for yourselves forever. The underpinning evidence that goes into that is really any feasibility you've done about the building or research on the income streams. You will need to think about an operational plan for the building, particularly if you haven't already been operating that building. When will it be open? What staffing will you need? Without being able to understand that, the assessors will find it really difficult to understand your financial projections and to work out whether they think they're sensible and plausible. In order to put together those financial projections, you're going to need to think about customers, market, competition, who else in the area is doing what you're doing, and also your pricing. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that now in terms of income and expenditure assumptions. So I wanted to give an example. I'm not going to go through this remorselessly, but thinking about your revenue, income, budget assumptions, I was thinking about a building that you haven't run before, that you're going to be running as a multi-purpose community hub. You're going to have a community cafe, do room hire, managed workspace, and so on. So the kind of assumptions that perhaps would go into your plans would be, for your community cafe, thinking about how many customers you're going to have per day when you first set up, how much they're likely to spend, how many days per month you're open, and thinking about what that would look like in quarter 1, quarter 2, quarter 3, quarter 4. Similarly, how many people, how many organizations are going to hire rooms when you first open? How much are you going to charge? And then thinking about how that might rise over the first year, the second year, the third year. If you have contracts or grants, talking about, in this case, I was thinking they've got a welfare rights contract. It's worth X per month. It's paid quarterly. It's secured until the end of March 2025. This helps the assessor to understand where your income is coming from. Similarly with a grant, if you've got a Reaching Communities grant, how much is it? When's it paid? How long is it secured for? And even if you do random fundraising, you could potentially look at what your plans are or what you raised last year to put that in and make that work from that point of view, so that you are providing a rationale for each of these. In terms of expenditure, a lot of this will come from perhaps what you did last year, if you already run the building, or you could look at what happens in similar buildings. You could look at industry norms. So thinking about cleaning and caretaking, you may have decided that for the size of the building, you're going to need 15 hours a week. And those of you who have spotted this, eagle-eyed, will note that I haven't upgraded this since the last set of minimum wage calculations. But you would be working out how much you were going to pay person per hour. That's how much it costs per week. On utilities, you might be looking at what the cost is for a similar building. You might be building in some additional costs for the fact that utility prices are high. On cafe supplies, you may be thinking about, there are industry norms about community cafes. So the industry norm is generally a third, a third, and a third. So a third on ingredients and inputs, a third on staffing, a third on overheads and profit. I've upped that to 40% in this model because the cost of food in particular is rising very strongly at the moment as part of the inflation issues we have. If you're getting a grant, are there associated costs? So putting into this things like, you know, we're getting a grant from Reaching Communities, but that obliges us to put on 3 10-week courses per year. We pay tutors at this amount. Our welfare rights contract involves us employing staff. This is who we employ. This is what it costs. So it's really thinking about what are the costs of actually running your organisation and allowing the assessor to be able to track back and understand your figures. In terms of strong financial and risk forecasts, we're looking at a clear business plan with details of how financial sustainability will be achieved. It'll include details of the research and feasibility work that you have done. It'll be really clear on the risks and mitigations. There'll be plenty of information. It'll include a risk register, and it'll also include plenty of information about how you've identified the risks and what you're going to do about them. Some risks you can insure against, some you can mitigate, some you will have to accept. Any building project is risky. It's risky doing the acquisition and refurbishment. It's risky to run. You're going to be managing a building, potentially managing staff and volunteers. You are going to be offering services to the wider public, including people who are vulnerable. There are going to be risks. Some of them are financial, but they can be a whole load of things. It can be that you don't have enough trustees to run the organisation. It could be around safeguarding. It could be around health and safety. There are a lot of risks, and you do need to be just showing that you understand the risks that you've taken on and that you've looked at what happens if they happen and how you're going to deal with them. Clear financial and cash flow forecasts with exhaustive details. Been through that and quite a lot of information. Justification of any revenue requested, including any pre-acquisition revenue. The revenue grant is there to help you to have a successful project. So you may want to use the revenue grant to help you to manage the build project, to help you to cover the costs of kicking off services. You may need to use the revenue grant to cover lost revenue, because if you're already running the building and you're going to do an extensive refurbishment, there are probably things which are not going to happen in that building for a measure of time. You are going to lose some income while you can't operate some of the rooms, you can't let them, and so on. So really think about that and make sure that you are thinking about whether you need to apply for a revenue grant. And excellent detail on planned activities and services. It can be very easy, particularly when you're in a competitive situation, to try and acquire a building, to get hung up on the capital issues, the refurbishment and things like that. It's really important to be clear about how that building's going to be used and who will benefit. The third part of the management case is around skills and resources. And what I want to start talking about is what you're asked for, which is relevant experience of delivering similar projects. Now, any relevant project management expertise in your board or in your staff team. Now, it is not a deal breaker if you don't have people within your staff team, but you need to demonstrating that you really understand what taking on a project of this size involves and how you're going to bring in that expertise if you don't have it in-house. So again, that's where you might be using your revenue grant to help you to bring in professionals to help you to project manage and so on. You're expected to be able to show that you understand the roles that are required to manage the asset. So you would be looking at, you may be looking to recruit more staff to manage the building or the other asset. Have you thought about this? How likely is it that you're going to be able to find people to undertake the roles that you're looking for? You're asked for information about governance and your membership structures, and also about the membership of your board, including their role and their main responsibilities. So we think at the back of this, what is required is board profiles. So a pen picture doesn't have to be War and Peace about who your board are, what their roles are, what their skills, their background, their lived experience is, how you're approaching things like decision making and board succession. Any experience of doing this type of project is really useful, and talking about the track record of your organisation and your senior team. If you are thinking that you are going to recruit staff, you need to be clear about what your recruitment plans. And if you are not already an employer, if you're not employing staff now, do you understand what it means to be an employer? All of this are things that you can bring in, that you can learn, but you need to be showing that you do understand it. We think it also requires an understanding of paperwork and accounting. If you're already running the building, you will have the policies and procedures in place which are needed to run an organisation and run a building. If you're new to this, you need to be showing that you understand the kinds of policies that you might need. Things like health and safety, safeguarding, and so on. You will have to be a legal entity, a company limited by guarantee, a CIO, a community benefit society in order to apply. You should be making sure that your submissions are up to date and so on. And you might need to think about your systems. If it's a new acquisition, or you're going to be expanding what you do considerably, then does your accounting system work for an expanded organisation or for the new organisation? Do you need to get help with HR policies and getting your systems in place for HR? Do you need a customer relationship management system? All of those systems, are you thinking about them and how that might work? Again, these are things which you might use your revenue grant for. You don't have to have them in place when you apply, but you might need to institute them very quickly when you're taking on the asset or doing the expansion. And a strong application is demonstrating that you're aware of the management requirements of the project that you are taking on, the acquisition and the build project, and your track record and proven skills in managing a similar project, or how you're going to bring those skills in. Evidence of skills and experience in managing a community project. And again, if you don't already have them, how are you going to acquire them to be ready to manage this project? Your assessor will want to see strong evidence of a well-functioning governance structure, effective decision-making, succession planning. Always going to be a concern if you have a small number of board members or trustees. What happens if you lose one or two of them and it starts taking you below minimum numbers? Recruitment plans well progressed. Do you know what you need in the staff that you are going to be trying to recruit? Have you had discussions? Have you tested the market? Is this going to be something where you can recruit people who are going to be up to speed? Will you need to train people? Are you confident that you can get people in place at the relevant time? Clear, consistent information on the makeup of the board. Always useful to check that the pen portraits that you're giving of your board are the same people who are registered on Companies House, on the Charity Commission website and other websites, to ensure consistency or to explain any discrepancy. Give information about how decisions are made, evidence that the board functions effectively. And I think, you know, an example is really helpful in these kind of circumstances. We needed to decide on X and this is what we did. And the final section, as you'll be glad to hear, is around representation, inclusiveness and integration. What is asked for? Bear in mind that there's a lot of crossover here with your strategic case. In the strategic case, you will have talked about the characteristics of your community, how it is made up, who is in your local community. The strategic case is looking at the wider picture. This is very much looking at representation, inclusiveness and integration in terms of the management of your asset. So how are the views of the local community going to be taken into consideration in running the asset? And how will the local community be involved in running the asset? How will you be accountable to your local area and to any specific communities that you are working with? So if you're doing specific work with young people or with older people or people with disabilities, how will they be really be accountable to them as well as being accountable to the wider place that you're based in? How will your asset be operated to be accessible to the whole of the community? So what we think is required, we think you will need a diversity, equity and inclusion policy, and that policy needs to have considered all the areas of your work. You'll need to evidence that inclusiveness and integration has been taken into consideration in developing your plans. And again, examples can be really useful. I guess, you know, one that comes up quite often is where you want to have a building which is open to everyone, but you also need to take into consideration safeguarding and how you're going to marry up those two things which could be at odds with each other. So any examples that you've considered would be really useful. Clarity on your membership structure. If you have a wider membership, who can be a member? Is there a cost to membership, etc.? The extent to which the board is representative of the community. And you will have the breakdown of your community from the work that you've done doing the strategic case. So how does your board map against your wider community? And remember that board representation is only one part of accountability. And identifying any barriers to inclusiveness and how you are endeavouring to overcome them. So what makes a strong application? Information and evidence on accountability. If you already run the asset, you'll be able to say how you're accountable to your local community. If you're not, then what are you going to do? It's very useful to give examples of how the organisation is rooted in the community, how the organisation has responded to community need and the ideas and preferences and priorities of the local community. Giving details of how the community will be involved in running the asset. Showing that your membership structure has no barriers, that it's proactive in seeking to increase its reach. An awareness of the need to be inclusive in the delivery of the project and in the use of the asset on an ongoing basis. And I'm going to finish by just 3 suggestions for some tips for things that you might do to help with your application. The first one is to do the research, making sure you can back up the information that you use. That can be really helpful for the assessor, but it's also really helpful for everyone in your organisation, that you understand how you've come up with the proposals that you have come up with, and understand the background and can challenge the assumptions. Provide explanations. Remember that you're really close to this project, but the person who's reading the application doesn't necessarily know your organisation or your area, and they need things explained in quite a lot of detail. Can you get someone who doesn't know your project in detail to read it and point out anything they don't understand? It can be so easy to write in jargon. It can be so easy not to spell things out because you're very close to the project. And an impartial view on it can be so helpful. And I'm going to stop there